Hello, everyone, and welcome to our HCM Town Hall, Pandemics as a Test of Workforce Sustainability. My name is Brad T.A., and I'm the Assistant Director of Administration for the Columbia University School of Professional Studies, Master of Science in Human Capital Management. Thank you for joining us today. We are recording this session. Before we get started, I'd like to share a brief introduction of our panel and share a few items about our event this evening. Lilian Ajayi is a university faculty at NYU School of Professional Studies. Lilian was rated by LinkedIn as top 25 marketing professionals in academia. As a global sharper and learning leader, Lilian is an expert in transformative learning. Josh Bersin is a world-known industry analyst and dean of the Josh Bersin Academy. He is the founder of Bersin & Associates, now known as Bersin by Deloitte, and is a thought leader within the HR landscape. Dr. Peter Cappelli is the George W. Taylor Professor of Management at the Wharton School and Director of Wharton Center for Human Resources. Dr. Cappelli, along with another one of our panelists, Dr. Tavis, have written extensively about agile and performance management. Dr. Tavis is Associate Professor and Academic Director of the Human Capital Management Department at NYU School of Professional Studies. Alongside Dr. Cappelli, Anna is here to discuss social distancing and contemporary management. Dr. Yvette Burton is a Professor of Professional Practice in Human Capital Management and Academic Director in the Master of Science in Human Capital Management at Columbia University School of Professional Studies. A seasoned executive with more than 20 years of applied business research and solutions, Dr. Burton will be the moderator of our town hall today. Throughout the town hall, we encourage you to participate in online polls that you can access via your phone or browser. On the screen, you'll see our first poll with instructions on how to participate. Please input your answers now. Let's see a few responses coming in. In addition, we encourage you to submit any questions throughout the town hall in the Q&A box located at the bottom of your screen. We will also conclude the town hall with another Q&A portion. And without further ado, I would like to introduce our moderator, Academic Director, and Professor of Practice for the HCM program here at Columbia, Dr. Yvette Burton.
Thank you, Brad. I was so touched by the vigorous response to the poll. Thank you for kicking us off, and welcome. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. We have a very global and committed and resilient group with us this evening, bonded by our common mission to rise and to share, connect, and convene during these unprecedented times. And I'm honored tonight to not just be able to do what is muscle memory to me, and I'll share a little bit about that because in today's environment, I think understanding the source and the perspectives and the importance of network is very relevant to our success as practitioners, as citizens of the globe, and as practitioners all committed through innovation and performance through people. And so this evening, not only, you heard the impressive resumes, but these are also mentors, friends, fellow trench mates, and people that I admire, yes, because they're brilliant, but more importantly, because they walk the gap between scholarship and practice. They know the difference between selling and scholarship. Why that's important, I can tell given the nature of the word cloud, and we do that, especially in these times, because understanding not only who's in the room, but how the room is feeling is incredibly central to the times that we have. And so as we are wedded to not only just pontificating, also sharing helpful tools and tricks of the trade to help scale the tremendous interest and passion we have here tonight. And so as you see, a lot of the words that are reflected, although the title may suggest that capital and resilience and workforce is restricted to business and all the things that are tangible, you see here that the backbone to individual resilience and organizational resilience is driven by, empowered by people. So I hope that we find you healthy. I hope that you are resilient and finding ways of being so in every role that you play in today's environment. and that this is the beginning of a conversation that you'll pass on. So without further ado, I want to continue to encourage you not to hold your questions to the end, but use the chat feature at the bottom of your screen. We have a team of people that are dedicated to rolling up themes and advancing your questions to us as collective community or to a specific speaker. So how did this idea to convene when we all are overwhelmed, situations are unpredictable and dynamic, how did this convening need come to be? And I really have to give credit to how this came to be from exchanges that I've had with my students, my mentees, my peers, and the inaugural class of the HCM program at Columbia. Like all students, all people who identify with being in the class of 2020, they are living purpose and resilience. And we've had occasion, as some of you may have had, to get more personal, more intimate, and more authentic than in our traditional work environment, being that work is now in our homes. And the courses or the students in the cohort are represent 5 generations of the workforce, reflective of who we are and what's going on in the workforce at all levels, in all sectors, and global and domestic. And as we got together to share what our key was to moving through crisis and what we've seen in effective leaders in organization, over and over again, that theme was purpose and resilience. You know, to all of the graduates out there, we see you, we know that, you know, some of you have been through 9/11 and this, and we know how hard it is to reach the successes that you have and the families that support you. And so, you know, just wanted to take a moment out to congratulate all of you and those that supported you getting here. And resilience and purpose manifest itself differently, but we found across the cohorts and sectors that we kept coming back to these 2 topics. And so what does that have to do with today's environment? Lots of that is obvious, but, you know, on the next slide, just to put into context, and I don't need to go over what the current environment is because we're all living it as we speak. And so investing in ourselves and taking a moment out to think about these issues is also a testimony to us, those that are grounded in service as a form of leadership. So as you can see, this is the obligatory scholarly slide. I love Oxford economics. And the one takeaway there, so if you look at the blue line, that's the predicted trajectory of no virus. You can only do a quick Google search or look in your newsfeed to look at what our notion was for the future of work. And when you look at the introduction of the coronavirus and what that did, changing our environment to 3% unemployment to upwards estimates of 20-25%, with 35 million people alone in the US are looking for employment. All of the predictive work, all of the estimates, we went from one job, you know, each person having available to them 3 jobs to this current state. And you can see as what they call this U, this jagged U, it's not a straight bounce back curve. And so making up for that gap between the blue line and the red line, companies are focused on, as you would expect, workforce economics. How much does our workforce cost, and who are our key and critical talent segments required for business continuity? How do we need to work differently to make sure that our employees are engaged and that they're focused, and of course, that they're productive? What do we need to do? What does leadership look like in this environment that's not reflective of where we're going? And so when I think about those questions, and I was in this discussion,
it dawned on me that, like muscle memory, this felt familiar. The issues that, the reflections that we see of the tension and the conflicts of when work, security, jobs, who we are as people, and our basic preservation collide. Yes, it's dynamic. Yes, there are things that are unpredictable, but there are some moments in the movement. And I'll share in a moment why I think about these times as movements, because there are movements that are, there are many movements, and there are moments in those movements to really matter and make a difference. And my experience in a movement that was as fundamental as this and as broad as this was my time and tenure working for the New York City Department of Health during an AIDS epidemic. First identified as gay-related immune deficiency syndrome, and as we worked with epidemiologists and sat with scholars and worked with organizations, then to be known as HIV/AIDS, and really worked at the science being enabled by technology, and really understood that these were not cases, these were people and lives. And asking people when they're at their most vulnerable to listen to institutions and adopting personal behaviors is tough. So whether it's wearing a mask or whether it's practicing safer sex, if you're an undocumented person in a country that doesn't trust institutions, then that is a task that's beyond compliance, beyond academic. And the diversity of us, makes it all the more rich as to why having this muscle memory, why facts matter, why experience matters, and why confidence in having a point of view based on what you know, especially as practitioners and scholars that have been focused on people being data-driven, business-led, and people-powered. And the pictures that you see of Dr. Fauci, I remember working back during the epidemic, times when it got contentious, times when he was the subject of this intangible monster, but also times where he was able to speak the truth about unpopular topics at a contentious time. And that picture at the bottom, which I'm hoping we move soon, was my way of, again, through connection, convening, sharing information. And yes, it was an environment where our diversity beyond being having same-sex partners, we were different in every other way with this life-altering, life-ending illness, highly politicized. So I share that to say, if we go on to the next slide, that part of what makes us resilient and sustainable, both at the individual level and at the organizational level, is knowing your purpose. And nowadays, you may have noticed there's a lot of focus on empathetic organizations, empathetic leaders, purposeful leadership. And at the end of the day, you know that you found your purpose when these overlapping areas come together and you're in your zone. And we'll have a chance to talk about performance management, talent, how you manage talent. But at the end of the day, if a leader is good and organization's processes work right, it's not just focused on your deficits, it's tapping into your purpose and scaling that through people, teams, organizations, and footprints. So the overlapping circles was the perspective for an individual focus. Organizations at this time, particularly with people, workforce, human capital management, the focus becomes how do we sustain our organization's purpose through crisis? And as you might have guessed, looking back at that jagged U curve, it's about managing costs. But more importantly, going back to our concept about the moment, and moments matter, We are neither who we used to be or what we will be. So how do we manage in the moment to be tactically relevant, to sustain ourselves individually as an organization? How are we clear about our core business? How do we protect our people, protect the business, and make sure that we're making short-term decisions that doesn't compromise? And if you're really focused on moments and metrics that matter, how do we leapfrog? And so areas where we were pontificating around, like virtual learning or credentials, or who owns the right to say what needs to be known, what is a skill gap, what's the value of a degree, what skills are what jobs can be executed, or middle skills without formal credentialing. This situation is also an opportunity that catapults some of those discussions, but it requires clarity in your purpose. So I want to now bring in my friends. And really the reason why I wanted to set the table of my journey and why I found resilience and sustainability around working in a workforce and any people-based solution to be key is not a stress or a contention that is new. So as you see on the screen, Abe Lincoln, you know, as a capitalistic country, deciding between capital and labor. And in fact, if you're in the human capital management disciplines or in HR, there's even a passionate debate about humans as capital. But again, to say these tensions and questions that we face are not easily just attributed to a side of an aisle or a country on the map. It's fundamental to living in balance, having purpose, and resilience. And so part of my ability to be resilient and to make these types of claims in environments that are unpredictable, and helping to get acumen, my own acumen, around how to get my mind around good questioning. So it's not so much about having the answer, but using questioning to organize our thinking about what we don't know, in addition to using our muscle memory. And Josh and I met back during the Deloitte days, early in the Bersin acquisition, and I was new. And so we had a shared sister and brotherhood around out-of-the-box people, thinkers, going through change. And I am honored to have Josh here as his ability to have quantifiable, people-based outlooks on how the levers that we have access to and that we have domain over can be influential in helping business performance, effective leaders navigate and seize opportunities like times like this. And so Josh, welcome and thank you so much for being here.
Hi, Yvette, thank you. Okay, well, thank you all. I think you're going to realize that this crisis is one of the biggest learning experiences of your lives for all of us. We're all learning. So what I'm going to do is spend a little bit of time on what I believe are the transformational impacts in the way we think of human capital that are happening before our very eyes in real time, I would add. So as Yvette said, I've been studying HR and training and topics in the area of workforce for about 21 years. And we just had, and was beginning to see the stress in the 11 or 12-year economic cycle we were in. I'm in my 60s, so I've been through 4 or 5 of these cycles. This one's particularly interesting and different. But we were, as of January, we were talking about the tight labor market, the low unemployment rate, the rapid automation of jobs, the future of work, the fourth industrial revolution, the employee experience. You know, we were talking about well-being as a product, sort of as a retention and engagement tool, not as a lifeblood of work. And then all of a sudden, this happened. And within almost a week, or maybe a little bit less, we started to change the entire framing of the future of work, and all of the things that we were worried about at the peak of the economic cycle seemed a little old. And from my perspective, I would agree with Yvette. I sensed an enormous amount of workplace anxiety before this happened. Standards of living were not keeping up with inflation. We had a lot of issues discussing income inequality, people not being sure if they were going to keep up with the digital skills that they needed. So you could sense, and CEOs were saying this, that we probably were going to have an economic slowdown, but we couldn't have predicted this one. I mean, this one definitely was a surprise. So what have we learned from this? Let me mention a couple things about what's going on among employees. By the way, I've probably had 60 or 70 conversations with CHROs and HR teams over the last 2 or 3 months. So I do have a lot of stories, but let me give you some data from some pulse surveys we're doing. As of 2 weeks ago, the #1 concern amongst the workforce was job security. People were very concerned about their employer, their jobs, and their particular incomes, and of course their personal health and safety, and then all the issues around family and kids at home, out of school, and beginning to become more and more concerned about work-life balance. As of this week, it's changed. Now people are really worried about operating in the world they're in, which is for many people, 60 to 70% of the US working from home. Not everybody's working at home, but a high significant are. By the way, an interesting thing that I found from the work at home trend was that more than 50% of companies didn't even have a remote work policy. So a lot of banks and insurance companies and regulated industries had to quickly create one, which they did, and have been dealing with issues of how do I get people technology, how do I create better workplaces at home, how do I create an ongoing communication process with people, how do we keep people engaged and productive at home. I mean, we don't have to commute, but now we have to actually deal with our kids or our dogs or our families, or maybe the fact that our house is not designed for working at home. And the issues of social resilience and personal resilience and sustainability have come up. And to give you a piece of information on this, people are actually working harder now than they were before. MetLife just did a study last week, and about 2,000 or so people responded. And the #1 concern on employees' minds was, quote, I am tired. People are tired of video calls, emails, things going on in the office that they can't keep up with. And obviously they're tired of the fact that they can't get the food they want or see their friends and families and take care of their own personal lives well either. On the HR side, I would say what's been inspiring to me, for those of you that are either in HR or entering HR, this has been really a heroic moment. This is a crisis where HR is really the heroes. I think the last crisis, the financial community and the banks and the federal government was the heroes. I think right now it's HR coupled with facilities and safety and IT that's really driving this. And amongst the biggest issues have been the human issues that Yvette was just talking about. In fact, one of the things, I'll show you some research on this in a minute, is that many HR people have told me that overnight, our culture changed in our company. Overnight, we became transparent. Overnight, we became more caring. Overnight, we started to think about human needs and health and workplace and personal needs amongst employees, whereas we were kind of paying it lip service before this. So, so this has been a, sort of in some sense, a positive change. And we just did a crowdsourced, we have this website called covidhrpulse.com where people are crowdsourcing their comments, and you can see support, patience, recognition, humor, transparency, messages from the senior executives every day, every couple of days. Those are positive things for culture in the workforce. So even though there's an enormous amount of stress with, something like 30 million people being out of work, the people that are affiliated with employers are basically saying, you know what, my employer is doing the best they can and they're taking care of me and I'm feeling good about it. And these are all the things they're doing. The interesting thing as I talk to companies about this stuff is they have done this very, very fast. One of the problems in the human capital space inside of big companies is this need to be agile. And there have been, interminable conversations and articles and discussions about how to become more agile in HR. And all of a sudden, HR suddenly got agile. Most of the companies I talked to told me that they did things over the weekend that they would have taken 3 months to do prior to the crisis. New onboarding programs, new training programs, enablement tools, protocols for safety are being invented in almost real time. And so we're kind of learning that we can move fast. But the other thing that we're learning in the HR profession is that we have to be coordinated. I'm going to talk about this for a second. One of the things, and I'm sure Peter has some great things to share with us from his research, one of the big challenges in the HR profession is how do we operate in an efficient, service-oriented way, but also act locally to respond to local needs. Well, this virus is very local. It behaves differently in every city, in every community. The laws keep changing in different communities. Around the world, we have some parts of the world that are back at work, some parts of the world that are not ready to be back at work. Every day there's a new press release from the president that gets us going in another direction. And so we need this ability to communicate. And what I've done over the last couple of months is study up on all this. And I want to take just a couple minutes and talk about this idea of command and control in human capital. And this comes from the military. And I did a lot of research on this during the 2008 recession. And what you find when you look at the military is, they've been studying asymmetric threats a lot over the last 10 years. And they believe that there are going to be more frequent, violent, asymmetric threats in the military sphere, which there are. I think you would also conclude that's exactly what's happening in business, is that this crisis, as bad as it is, and life, it's sort of a once in a lifetime thing, may not be a once in a lifetime thing. We actually have these kinds of threats more frequently than you realize in companies. For me personally, I was thinking about it. I got laid off in 2001 from the 2000.com thing. We had a fire and had to leave our home and completely disrupt my family in the mid 2000s out here in California. We've had an earthquake. We've had 9/11, obviously, the Iraq War. We've had Brexit. Wells Fargo's had a financial crisis. Boeing's going through a crisis. Every time there's a cybersecurity leak, it's a crisis. And now we have the coronavirus crisis. This is more frequent than you realize. And so we have to think about human capital strategies in HR departments as being resilient in themselves and creating resiliency for these kinds of events. In fact, even Bill Gates made an interesting comment last weekend. He believes this pandemic is a warm-up for more pandemics. And, I don't think he has any reason to scare us, but I believe him. I mean, the coronavirus is mutating, and there will be other viruses probably in our lifetime. So it leads you to believe, and by the way, this was a funny thing. I found this piece of research from Accenture that's 2 years old, where they were basically saying the same thing, but nobody was paying attention because we were so excited about the stock market and the job market. So one of the things we have to take away as a learning experience from this situation that we're in is how do we design human capital strategies to not only be efficient and responsive, but to also be resilient and adaptive. And if you go back to the military's been doing this and they've figured this out. And what the military basically found is that in the world of asymmetric threats of the military type, there are a bunch of things to do. One is to create what they call a socio-technical system. And if you get under the covers of what that means, what they're basically saying is we need systems and data and platforms and communications, but we also need human beings that have relationships with each other. So relative to HR, one of the things I've been, sort of helping HR departments do is make sure they have a lot of human connections so that when something happens, you know who to call, you have a relationship with that person, and you have a sense of trust. They also find, like in the third bullet, that skills and training are central to success. As one of the admirals in the Navy said to me, he was my boss for a while, he said, basically in the military, we only do two things. We fight and we train. And when we're not fighting, we're training. And in some sense, that's a little bit of a message for us in HR. And one of the reasons I got into the professional development business myself is I really think we have a lot of continuous learning to do in HR as HR professionals, as human capital leaders. And all of you obviously on this video understand that. This issue of being able to deal with ad hoc partners, ad hoc situations. Companies are lending their workers to other companies, for example. There are talent marketplaces that have grown up out of this crisis where companies are saying, I'll pay your benefits and I'll introduce you to this other company that's hiring so you can go work for them for a while and then come back and work for us when this is over. In fact, one of the advertising agencies told me they're so worried about losing their best people because the ad business has dropped. They're basically telling their people, we would like you to go work for one of our competitors for a little while if you can find a job and then come back to us afterwards. That's ad hoc stuff that people hadn't thought about before this. And then at the bottom, there's this obvious need for innovation and creativity, which is really what we're living in, is a world of invention. Nobody really knows how to respond to this until they've done it. And then this need for shared awareness and data. And for those of you in the program, you know that analytics and data are a huge part of HR now, a mandatory part of HR. So that's now become sort of instrumental. So the reason I show you this is because when I was reading through all these things, I realized they all apply to HR. I mean, we can almost take all these military command strategy books and say, hey, that's about, you know, what we do here in our organizations too. So that's been an interesting learning experience. The next topic I want to talk briefly about is resilience, because that's, you know, kind of the theme. And I'll just give you a couple thoughts there. I mean, I think from what I've seen in my life and my career, human beings are incredibly resilient. Individuals in our lives, we adapt to a lot of things. You have an accident, you hurt yourself, you have a crisis at home, you have a work problem, you usually deal with it. We are relatively good at this. Now I had a good, interesting call with Martin Seligman last week, who's a very famous psychologist, and he did a lot of work with the Army, and he found that the 5% of soldiers who suffer from PTSD have certain problems. One of the problems is they don't have an optimistic point of view about life. So optimism is part of resilience. And having fun is part of resilience, which we have to do more of. But generally, we're pretty resilient. But what isn't resilient is organizations. And so one of the things that I would encourage you to think about in your curriculum and in your studies is how can you create practices in HR, in human capital, that can adapt? Because a lot of the things that we do, the operating models, the performance management systems, are sort of designed for a certain business cycle. And then when the business cycle changes, we're like, that's not working anymore. So there's a lot of learning going on in companies about how to adapt. For example, a lot of companies are stopping their performance management process immediately and changing it to adapt to the situation they're in, because the business plans, of course, are out of date. And I think this is going to continue for a while. I mean, it's interesting if you read up on the pandemic, I'm sure a lot of you are, there's a lot of research that's pointing out that this virus, we don't really understand it yet. And so a lot of the things we need to do to respond to it, we don't know. So I think we're in the middle of what I call a big reset. And it's a reset of many things. It's a reset of how we work. It's a reset of how we spend our money. It's a reset of how leaders behave. It's a reset of how we listen to people and deliver competent solutions. And it's a reset of our role. And I think for those of you in HR and those of you moving into HR, this is a heroic period of time where HR is going to emerge as an even more important part of companies than before this all happened. Now, in terms of the next step, let me just spend 2 or 3 minutes on this and I'll turn it back over to the host. In all of my conversations with companies, there's basically 3 things going on. There's this reaction to, oh my God, what happened? Who's affected? Get the data and deal with it immediately. Then there's the response, which has been largely around remote work, policies for safety, identifying the people that are at risk, helping people with home situations and personal life, being fair, that some people will not be able to work as hard as others. There's a funny conversation I had, Microsoft had a new policy they just introduced to allow people with children at home to take 8 weeks sabbatical or 8 weeks paid break. And somebody said, that's not fair. I don't have kids at home. How come I don't get that? And I'm thinking, boy, that's a really interesting conversation to have. So these are the kinds of things that are coming up. And then the third thing that's starting to happen that I think is the most mysterious of all, but we're going to have to figure it out, is how do we go back to work in some new form? It won't be the same. And I would say that what I've learned, and certainly I'm not the expert on this yet, but I'm learning as fast as I can, is we're not going to go back to work in the same way. Not only will the office change, the work environment will change, we'll have a different kind of cafeteria, the elevators will be different, the desks will be different. We're not going to be crammed into offices right next to each other the way we were anymore. There'll be policies for how to have meetings, but the way we go to market is going to change. Hospitals are basically saying, I don't know if you know this, but hospitals are suffering from a lack of demand because people don't want to go to the hospital. So they're staying home and they're sick. And so digital health is exploding. One of the hospital systems I talked to told me that their digital health service has grown by 2 orders of magnitude in the last 60 days. And so they're training all of their medical professionals to do digital health. Same thing's happening in banking, that the transportation industry will change. So all of these things are going to affect human capital because people are going to move into new roles, and they're going to do it because it's going to be the new company. And so let me just conclude with that, and I'll turn it back over to the panel. I think the biggest lesson that I'm taking away from this pandemic, in addition to the need for a focus on the human part of work, which I couldn't agree with you more, that this is a focus on the human beings, is that we are now going through a business transformation. We thought the digital transformation of the last 10 years was a big deal. Well, now we just accelerated it by a sort of 2 orders of magnitude. Transforming the businesses we're in, the roles, the workplace. We are now bonding together IT, HR, safety, and facilities into one integrated team. We're going to find ways of empowering people to work in a more distant and remote fashion. We're probably going to have more drones and electronic devices and robots at work. That was already starting. Now that'll happen faster. But I think the most positive of all this is that at the center of it all, what companies are learning, and I don't know that the political system is learning this, but I think companies are learning, is that we don't have companies without people, and we don't have effective companies without people who feel safe, empowered, and supported. And, from the research I'm seeing, and I'm very curious what the other, people have to say on this panel, CEOs are getting this. They are, I sort of use this concept that the CEO is the chief empathy officer. That's really starting to happen. And so I think we're going to set in place a new kind of culture of work coming out of this that hopefully will be more people focused than ever before. So let me stop there and turn it back over to the host, and I'll be there for questions at the end.
Thank you, Josh. There's been a lot of interest in the topics that, the landscapes that you laid out, and thank you for that. One observation and one question. So one of the sentiments in the chat is that it's important for HR professionals, people managers to not be only internally focused, but to have their attention on the landscape. And so a lot of HR professionals struggle with being so removed from, and so so that was one, is that there was an aha that came from that. But the other was an aha around, often when we talk about inclusion, there's talk of whether it's political. The example that you gave around the military, there's a difference between the purpose of an organization that is devoted to the veterans and are going beyond just
having numbers of them make up a good soundbite versus the company that incorporates and engages their vets so that they can discover scenario building and some of the things that you mentioned, whether it be after action learning or some of the things that come from military. So part of a business's success and why it's important in getting your head around the unknown and organizing your thinking about what you know. It's not about bringing in people for politics. It broadens your capacity at times like this to tap into different levels. So thank you for that. The one question I have before we go on to the next segment is, how has your experience as a scholar and practitioner informed each other during the crisis? Because if you're not in a classroom or boardroom, how has that shaped how you think about the space?
Well, I'm not sure if I'm a scholar. I did a lot of scholarly stuff earlier in my career. I'm very pragmatic. My feeling about human capital is if it isn't working, you probably shouldn't be doing it. So as much as we want to have long-term strategies for planning and development and organizational design and innovation, we have to do that. Right now, I'm amazed at the inventiveness and creativity of the HR people I talk to. And I do think one of the fundamental changes in HR, for those of you that are studying the domain, is it is becoming an innovative part of business. You're going to be asked to invent things when you go to work in a big company. You're going to be asked to come up with new ideas that nobody's done before. And I'm seeing that all the time. And I think all this business about having a seat at the table, nobody's mentioning that anymore. HR people are at the table and they're being expected to, come up with creative ideas to this particular crisis. And I think the domain and the expertise that you guys have and that you deliver at Columbia is critical to doing this well.
Thank you, Josh, and looking forward to you rejoining us in a few segments. So let's take another poll. What best describes where your organization's focus is? So if we define learning as not just traditional learning, if we define it as experiencing something and then being immediately able to be informed how to do it better the next time, let us know what you're thinking. And as we have that coming in, and again, please do feel free to forward your questions along as we go. I want to just talk about our next segment for a bit, because it's not only a great follow-up to what Josh has laid out as the state of our union and the importance for us to step into the moment, to not enable, but to lead. I want to share that I'm really excited about the next topic. State-of-the-art practice for many organizations and practitioners is this notion of there's an integrated lens to how people, how they perform, how they, what they're motivated by, and how to do that in an integrated fashion that allows for the sense and respond dynamics that Josh talked about. And in order to have that agility and to ask questions, that requires trust and a lot of the competencies that we talked about in both of our prior segments. And Peter and Anna are not just consummate professionals and experts that have been talking about this. And I would suggest, you'll get the recording, and Brad had mentioned the Harvard Business Review article. But Peter has been a mentor in getting through to diverse people on dense issues, and a personal inspiration of mine. And Anna, also a person who sits, a unicorn that sits at the intersection of scholarship and practice and a bias for results. And so I want to thank and welcome both of them and ask them just to give us their view of this whole notion of having to be responsive, its connection to business and individual performance, And also continuing on the thread of, we're not just distant from this. How has it shaped your perspective in practice and in scholarship, but also personally? So welcome and thank you for making time to be here.
Thank you very much, Yvette. Thank you, Josh, for a good introduction. I think it's a perfect connection to what Peter and I are going to be talking about. And we don't have slides, so we're going to be a jazz band going back and forth and mostly reflecting on what we've done in our work and research and the current exploration of the landscape we're in, but also connect a little bit to the past and build on some of the topics that Josh highlighted. I want to start by quoting Rita McGrath, who is also a Columbia professor, and she's a guru in entrepreneurship and innovation. And what she's talking about now, and I love that phrase, she's saying the future cannot be planned, it should be discovered. And I think that that's where we're in right now. We're in the discovery. And if you're hearing answers to the questions that we're asking now, then you're not hearing the right answers. I think we should be looking for questions. And that's where I appreciate the work that Josh is doing and the work that we are all engaged in looking at what's actually emerging. Because it's very easy to be looking for patterns in the past, but a lot of what's coming in and the weak signals and how we are going to actually work in the future post-vaccine. I've heard that now it's not even post-COVID, it's post-vaccine environment we're going to be in. That a new workplace is still emerging, and there are weak signals that we need to pick up on, as well as trying not to impose too much of that past perspective. That's what I want to focus on. At the same time, so as we're gathering data, it's very, very important to gather data. We also have to be listening to stories. And I think it's a combination of looking at what's happening and at graphs and numbers, as well as capturing the stories of people who are living in those environments and listening to the employees who are just in the midst of this experience. We don't know where we're going to end up. The one thing that I really don't want to talk about is the new normal. I think we're all a little bit tired of that phrase. So let's put ourselves in this position of discovery and see what's emerging. And in some ways, Peter and I did exactly that just a few years ago. I think we partnered in 2016 when we realized at the time when everyone was kind of looking at performance management that there are new signals that are emerging about how to do performance management differently. And that's what led us to a whole series of conversations, multiple conversations with companies around what they were doing, what kinds of issues they were trying to solve for. And Peter will speak to what we've discovered and how it connects to some of the specifics of what performance looks like now in the social distancing and remote working environment, and what it will be when we get to that post-vaccine phase of this crisis. And from performance management that Peter will talk about, we also discovered agility, how it was coming into HR. HR became curious about what this agility is and how it was different from the supply chains, the lean, the Six Sigmas that preceded the agile phase. And so indeed, the conversations led to digital transformation and the tools that were coming in and technology companies that were transforming themselves, adjusting to the new ways of working. And I think the acceleration we're experiencing now, some of it is a function of overnight digitization. Some of the companies we talked to, I revisited them recently, and they said, yes, we had a 2-year plan to transition to agility and digital, and we had work groups set up, and we had the charts and the war rooms set up, and all of it happened within 2 weeks. So that's an acceleration that we've experienced with this epidemic. But, and you hear the sirens at the back because I'm also in New York City. So just a little bit of the history, and then I will pass it over to Peter and then jump back in again. So what we've noticed was without the crisis, the need to accelerate because the business models were changing, and they were changing in certain industries, not universally. And the courageous individual HR leaders like Diane Gerson from IBM, Donna Morris from Adobe at that time. So it did take leadership to listen to those trends, look at those trends, and have the political capital and the courage to actually move their organizations in the right direction. So they're the ones that were actually most prepared for what happened overnight. They're the ones fighting the norms of the time that pioneered remote working, that were looking at different ways of collaborating, and were focused on innovation. So that's how we highlighted agility and looked at how it specifically transformed some of the HR processes. And I want to actually call on Peter to reflect on how he thinks the performance management is changing right now under the conditions of remote working. But before that, I also want to say that there will be a new trends that we're not aware of that are just coming to the surface. And I agree, Josh, that it's amazing to see how quickly we could transform, but I also would not think that rallying around the flag and responding to a crisis is sustainable. A lot of people, to your point, are working overtime, and we are not there yet to see. We're still in the process of flattening the curve and still fighting the virus. We are not here yet to see where we're going to end up. And some of the beginnings of the solutions are emerging, but it's too early to say. And I just want to encourage all of us, and this is where the academics, the researchers, the analysts are coming in with the right questions, looking for the trends, for the weak signals, and hopefully eventually, sooner rather than later, we are going to be in that new workplace that is so needed. Peter, what do you think about performance management and how it's transforming itself right now?
Thank you, Anna. So I'll say a little bit about performance management, particularly around this topic of working from home, which is making the performance management question particularly salient. But let me spend 1 minute on the big think topics we've been talking about and the extent to which the current virus and shutdown is a learning opportunity. It certainly is, but it is important to remember that we don't always learn from these opportunities. If you look back at the Great Recession, which was unfortunately not that long ago, right? About a decade, and it lingered for a very long time. And if you'd ask yourself, what did we learn from that? I think you'd be hard pressed to say what we learned and actually adjusted to. It was a very low probability event that ended up being catastrophic for the economy. What did we do to prevent that? Again, maybe not much, right? And one of the problems that we have with respect to trying to be so flexible and adaptable and move quickly is that we find it difficult to take the long-term view on much of anything. And because we don't take the long-term view, we don't learn very much, partly because we're not so concerned about the future. Our tenure as CEO is pretty short. My time in this particular job might not be very long. What happens 10 years out? I don't know. I'm not going to be here. It's not particularly relevant for me. And partly because of that, there's a lot of low probability events like the current coronavirus, which take some real long-term investments and a long-term perspective if we want to solve these. It's not something we're going to solve quickly. And if we solve it for this particular virus with a vaccine, it's not going to help us with the next pandemic that comes down the pike. So, we need a commitment to thinking long-term as well as to being flexible and adaptable in the earlier periods. I think Anna was the person who pushed us to thinking about agile and what it meant, and maybe come back to her in a minute and talk a little bit about how agile has been reinterpreted in ways which, are maybe not always terrific, right? But let's talk about working from home for just a bit here. One of the things we can see is that a lot of it is going on. And the difference now, there's a Gallup poll that found that 72% of Americans say they had been working from home, but there's a huge difference between what that meant, which was people cutting out on Friday afternoons to take calls from home to start the weekend, and being out of your office for months at a time and never going back in. And one of the things that we know about this now is that most organizations, as Josh was saying, they didn't have a plan for this. We didn't do much of anything. We just sent people home and said, try to do your jobs, right? And we knew a fair bit before doing this about what works in terms of managing people from a distance. We didn't apply much of any of that, frankly. And the interesting thing will be, what do we do when we bring people back? So I saw a survey of C-level folks, or at least it claimed to be of C-level folks, that's saying it was quite surprising, stunning finding about what their big concerns were going forward. And the biggest of the concerns that they said they faced was how to manage a remote workforce going forward. That was their top priority. And when asked what was the thing that they thought was most important to learn about afterwards, the question or the answer was learning about how to manage remote workers. So, this is something that's certainly on people's minds. Are we going to learn anything from it? Well, what do we know right now? There's another Gallup poll out saying that 59% of Americans say that they would like to do more working from home than when the virus is over and we go back to work. They would like to do more of it than they have been doing. I wouldn't take that as evidence that it's going to happen, though, right? Because the problem is we really don't know whether this is going to have worked or not. But here's a reason for thinking that it probably did not work. Think about all the time and effort that we spend, particularly around human resources, trying to motivate people in the workplace, okay? And we do that with office design, removing distractions, giving people all the assets there, having your boss there, having your peers, having a structured environment that eliminates distractions. And we're going to take all that away and we're going to send you home with your family and your kids and your distractions. And we think that's going to work better. Well, that's a pretty good bet, a big bet. And I wouldn't particularly want to bet on that, right? So the question is going to be, though, can we persuade our organizations to learn something from this experience once we start trying to bring people back? Here's what I think we're going to learn, and here's what I think we ought to try to do right now. The first thing is we need to have consistent policies. So up until now, the way most companies have managed working at a distance is it was entirely up to your immediate supervisor. In this part of the business, you could work from home. In this other part, doing the same job, you couldn't. And the reason is your boss in the second place just assumed everybody was lazy, and if you weren't watching them, they would be watching Gilligan's Island all day. We can't have that anymore, and my guess is that's one thing that will change even when we come back, is that we will have department-wide or company-wide policies, and we need to have that right now. I think we've probably already got it, or at least have it going right now. The second thing we have to do is get better at managing performance. And that means when you're working from home, what is it we actually want you to do? What are we going to measure when you are done with your job at the end of this week? How often are we going to check up, and what are we going to be checking? You know, the thing is that we don't do that very now when people are in the workplace, right? So I was talking to a vendor today who had this great idea. They said, well, why don't we just look at the performance differences from people working from home compared to those when they were working in the office? I said, that's a great idea, except we don't have any performance measures of how people were doing in the office, or most places don't, right? So trying to figure out how to manage people from a distance, something we know a fair bit about, but it means we got to tell them what we want them to do, what we're going to measure. We got to measure it. We have to keep checking in with them. One of the things that Anna and I learned was the big revelation of this performance management revolution was the importance of moving away from bureaucratic tick the box exercises, which weren't doing any good and everybody hated them, towards something more like continual feedback. So we got to do that, and we have to start doing that from a distance as well. The last issue, let me just raise it, which is a profound one, maybe we could talk about later, is now we've done such a good job persuading people of the importance to do social distancing and stay home that now we got a problem getting them to come back. The majority of Americans say they're much more concerned about coming back to work than they are about waiting too long to restart the economy. So, you know, the problem is we got to persuade them to come back now. And that is going to be an HR informed exercise. First, to persuade them why it's important to come back, why we need their help, and also why taking some risk is part of life. We've been doing such a terrific job trying to drive the risks down to zero by staying home, but we can't do that forever, right? So we got to do that. We got to persuade them that the place is going to be safe. And if we could at least get that far, that would be terrific. Part of that, though, is going to require being able to persuade them that the home environment and the office environment are not so different. We're going to have to do social distancing in the office. We're going to have to persuade them that the place is clean. We're going to have to do all those things, which we have probably never done before. But I think the big thing, if there's a structural change going forward from this, is can we use this opportunity to learn something? And that requires a different mindset. If we could do that, we could start learning all the time, even from the things that are not nearly as dramatic as this coronavirus experience. Anna, we got a few minutes left. Let me turn it back to you, Anna, and ask you, cold call you now, and ask you about Agile, and what do you think is happening to Agile in this new environment? Certainly the small group kind of Agile stuff is pretty difficult to pull off, right?
Yeah. I think, Peter, I second your concern about too much confidence about how we've changed overnight. That's where I started. We know very little about how to build those collaborative cultures, how to build collaborative teams entirely online. Because what's going on now is sort of we are leveraging, we are using the social capital that's been created prior to the crisis. So people were just sent home to work from home, and yes, it's working for as long as those relationships are still in place. What we don't know, and I'm not saying necessarily that it's not going to happen, but we really don't know how you can build the whole organizations if the majority of your people are going to be fully remote. And all the conversations are taking us back to technologies available to us. We know very little about the psychology of what's going on. And I wouldn't be too pessimistic, but I also am saying that we do not know. This research is just beginning to happen. And I think it's going to be difficult to say how the agility that you and I have been writing about, that's created from a face-to-face interactions, from constant communication between the team, visible and invisible science, and kind of the camaraderie, esprit de corps that creative, innovative teams have created, how it's possible to replicate, unless you're using, you know, augmented reality, virtual reality. That's where we are going, again, through technology. But this is still very unknown. And I think we're going to be, the best we can do is to continue learning, continue asking questions, and continue to listen to stories so that we can reconstruct discover that future that's coming and not plan for it.
And let me leave you with my little last possible learning thing here. One of the things I think everybody is learning is they're saying, gosh, I'm so sick of these Zoom meetings at work already, right?
Yeah.
And if that's true, weren't we sick of meetings in the office too? And the answer was, yes, we were. So can't we do something about that? It's just reminded us that we've got probably too many meetings. They're not very productive. We've known this for a while. Why don't we do something about it? We all understand that now. Can we have the political will inside organizations to do something about it?
Thank you both. There's a timelessness in the points that you raised because there's still gap between the aspired capabilities and awareness that are required to be agile. I was taken by the notion of what is the impact of having Zoom be in our homes literally. We've probably all heard lots of funny stories about camera mishaps or what happens when the pristine veneers that we developed in our work cells are pierced by a puppy or insert here. But also, it's not just those comedic instances. It's the CEO who we have total reward structures around based on a persona of being in a particular class, having an education, and then discovering at a time like this that they have a sibling that has a mental disorder from a different class, not educated. So our treatment of the employee and demonstrating or reacting to a notion of wellness, relevance, commitment. Do you see anything in your walks or have any thoughts about how having a more authentic understanding of who we are and the bonds that come from crisis, what can we take from that to reinvent, whether it's how we pay people or what we consider benefits or how we think about the person as a whole?
I think it's a terrific opportunity for leaders to ask for help from their employees. We need your help, right? And the problem is that you could seize this opportunity. We are in this together, right? The problem is if after asking for their help, you act as if then we're not in this together, right? If you do as we're starting to see some of our bigger companies do now, they're backing away from some of the things that they had done for their employees in the first month of this virus experience, right? And if you turn completely back to focusing on costs and shareholder value and you start slashing jobs and, you know, we need your help, we're really in this together. People want to feel like they are contributing. I think that's why so many people are so adamant about staying home now. It's an incredible sacrifice, but they feel like it is the right thing to do. It's such an opportunity for business leaders to seize that, but you can't be a hypocrite about it. And that's the big dilemma. Will they be able to execute this? It's pretty easy to do until it comes to having to sustain it, and then we got a problem.
And to your earlier point, Yvette, I think we're going to experience very different categories of diversity and inclusion. Something that's never been an issue around, you know, family members, to your point. You know, this working from home means, you know, what kind of home do you have? The inequities that are coming up that never really impacted the performance in the office because everyone was in the same more or less space and with the same boundaries. All of a sudden, what we call in research contaminants, all of these unexpected contaminants in the family, with the family, for example. And what we're hearing from some of the leaders I do is saying, you know, we are really getting 80% of the performance from 15% of the employees because of these circumstances at home. So how this is going to be resolved in terms of, to Peter's point about how we're going to be even measuring performance and what kinds of goals are we going to set, is very, very unknown, and it depends on the company you're in. And also, obviously, in the same company, if it's a diversified business, you have essential workers. I talked to a few of my colleagues in pharmaceutical companies, for example, and they have the fortunate people who are working from home and can carry on with their jobs. And there are people in manufacturing in the front lines that are in very different situations. And how do you evaluate the risk? How you factor in the risk in their performance evaluation? So there are lots of questions that we need to be asking right now, I think, in addition to kind of looking at the numbers and trying to figure out where the trends are going.
Right, that's an excellent point, and understand the relationship between the two. And the point that you made, Anna, about essential skills, the notion that we could have leaders that when they hear the words essential in one setting, in a crisis setting, means those people who are most at risk, least have a line of sight into internally what businesses call those key talent segments, so that critical workforce segment. And, you know, knowing that connectivity between externals, the main core of business, those skills that are aligned, that's a different behind the doors conversation than essential workers, and reconciling the incongruence between government workers, those that are on the front lines that are touching our lives literally every day, and reconciling, going back to the Lincoln question, the relationship between our purpose as people and the role of capital in sustaining business and us. So thank you for that. And I'm looking forward to both of you rejoining the segment for Q&A after our last segment here. Lilian, which is perfect timing, and I'm so excited. I've gotten so many questions about learning, and we're going to go ahead and just do another poll. Again, the intentions of these polls or the Q&A is to just let us collectively hear what we're thinking. And so, if you would, well, this poll we've already gone through, and you may have entered one response, and it's good if you've had more questions. I see the chat on the side with the questions and responses. But, you know, all of these, it seems like my takeaway would be that all of these are appropriate focuses based on where your organization is, the capabilities that you have, the geographies that you're in. Yes, there are, you know, New York is in one place, but our manufacturing plants are in another region. And so we're having to work with our neighbors as part of our ecosystems to resolve getting back to work in ways that have nothing to do with the walls of the office. So thank you for that. And Lilian, I want to welcome you and thank you for your work. I'm really interested, and the questions have been coming around the topic of learning, picking up from where Anna and Peter left off. There was a lot of talk before the pandemic around the skill gaps, credentialing. Was traditional academic education going out of business? How the gap between industry and academia bared much of the responsibility for not keeping the learner at the center. The politics of, you know, knowledge is power, and who defines what needs to be known and how we need to know it. So I would love to hear personally, professionally, you straddle academia and also are leading on the topic of learning at every level. What are you hearing, and what are your thoughts?
Yeah, so I think, there's been a dramatic shift, and I love how you kind of phrase it, how all along learners were supposed to be the center of our little bubble, right? And it's so funny how last semester I was working on some, I was awarded Dean Scholar for NYU, which was awesome. So I got to do some research for them, and I was talking about looking at learning and learners and the relationship with the teacher, and then separately looking at the relationship of the teacher to the university. And so in my opinion, what's really changed, right, the paradigm shift that we've seen is threefold, right? There is an impact on learners, and surprisingly, I think we didn't give our students more credit, but our students are resilient. And I think the reason why our students are resilient is because they realize that learning is a vice for transformation. So in order for them to transform, which is their intention anyway when they come into this learning environment, they have to be willing to play their part, which is to be active learners, to listen, to take guidance, to get the leadership from the teacher. But then the teacher, which is the second part of this debate, of this argument, is that the educator now has a new role. I think Josh kind of talked a little bit about the area that I was going to focus on, but it's this idea of us coming into a new role as an agile teacher and educator, right? So instead of leading from a knowledge base, we're leading as, emotionally, like you said earlier in your opening, right? We're looking at other attributes that really support us in the classroom so that we can create the learning models that our students can use to be better, because our students are leaning on us to help them get through this period without discovering noise about, societal news and what's going on in the pandemic and who's impacted. And I think the interesting thing about, teachers as agile, we should be the most agile, but I think it depends on the industry, the topic, the departments, and what that, you said it earlier, which was so beautiful, what is the purpose of the educator, right? If it's, for me, I am a leader that kind of leads from the heart, but I'm also very agile because I know that it's important for me to remain in this position in order for that transformation to happen in my class time and time again. And I think what's interesting in this role is that people who have this agile mindset, right, are able to adapt to the new virtual transformation that we're experiencing with our learning. And I was just reading an article in preparation for this interview that in India, they had a very big struggle with the teachers in getting them to onboard to do more of like an online learning. And so I was looking at the percentage rate of adoption. It was like 60% adoption the following week after there was this global shutdown due to the pandemic. So the last thing that I also think that we didn't pay attention to before, but I think the shift is happening, is the relationship between the university and their ability to establish trust in the learning space. And so I'm a data scientist, so I can't help it. So I actually gathered some data because I think it's important for our universities to understand what role they play. Teachers also need to understand what role they play because we represent the school in our classroom. So in terms of projections, and these numbers are already out, enrollment rate globally is down by about 5%. So they compared it to this quarter of this year versus last quarter. So the only difference is about 2%, which is not much, but here is the catch. The biggest decrease that we did see is new enrollment. So there is an 18% decrease in the number of enrollment that we've seen globally. And I think that a lot of it has to do with establishing trust. And I think, the previous speakers also talked about it, is we need to train our teachers, right? And university also we need to have an alignment with how do we position ourselves in the classroom so that our students don't feel like there'll be a disconnection between how they used to learn before and what that learning environment is right now. Just to share a personal story, one of my friends, when I was telling her how hectic the transition was from in-person to virtual, she made fun of me because she's like, I got my M.B.A. from an online program. So I don't know what's the big deal, but it is a big deal because in terms of value proposition, when you think about it from a marketing standpoint, we marketed the college, the experience on campus, the ability to connect with other students. No, like the students that we have now, millennials are not, right? have this idea of human connection. So that needs to be a key element in order for learning to continue to thrive. And what I pretty much came up with a term or a phrase because of all of this, to kind of a phrase to cover up and explain what this experience really mean and why knowledge is something that people are always going to sought after. And it's not something that's definitely going to lose motivation. We just have to build trust. And the way that we build trust is by arming our teachers, and the university have to take a position in explaining what they're going to do differently and how they've equipped their educators in how to transact in the classroom, right? And so the statement that I came up with is, if we can achieve the notion that learning is a universal language, then there will be a reversal, immediate reversal, drastic reversal in the number of new enrollments. And so I also want to add that, you know, for those of you who are percentage-wise, you're like, what is the hard number? And I did look up the hard number in terms of what is our overall operational loss. So right now, the loss is down by 27% compared to the last quarter of this year. And the number is about 25.1 million is what we're really losing in terms of that. So it's really hurting us financially, right? And forget about the finance, because knowledge is about being able to collectively grow as a group, as an individual, and what have you. I think what we really need to focus on is establishing trust between the university and the teachers and the students, and then the students and the university. And once we are able to balance that evenly across these three characteristics, then we can really fulfill the true premise or purpose of education and the need for transformation, which our students are constantly craving. And that desire is never going to go away. And we just have to ensure them that you are safe. And yes, you know, there are some vulnerability because our students are thinking about jobs. Some of them are graduating. A lot of my students, when they come to my class, is their final semester. And so helping our students, like, I think we need to be a little bit more visible in terms of helping our students prepare post-university. So it's not about, you know, building a relationship with you, establishing a relationship with you while you're on campus, but really thinking about what their experience is going to be like after they graduate. And I think that's what I see in terms of a triangle, is how do we connect these relationships that should be working together? And I know that's an intention, but the disruption is the fact that the pandemic has shifted the focus, and now we need to shift the focus back using trust as our own principle that unites all of our voices.
I love that, Lilian, the trust, because, I mean, really learning is allowing yourself to be ignorant and to be open. And it is so not okay, even at some universities, to appear not all-knowing. But the point that you made about our responsibilities, both on the employer side and on the, as educators, if we keep students in the middle or new employees in the middle, the implications are that they want to engage in a vision. They don't want to respond to an open job opportunity with no organizational point of view and commitment to, you will be in this role for this long, have these experiences, and then your options or your pathways are. And then there's different language between academia and business. There's, you know, and again, an opportunity around difference to really be mindful how we organize our thinking to fill gaps around skills, and to have, as to bring what you were saying back to Josh's points about the military, you know, strategic workforce planning with the military requires that you know, in order to make a missile, where you get your skills from, where you're going to get the higher return on investments. And if it takes 15 years to make an RF engineer, then you have to know what universities have the highest yield of graduates, how is the business sector going to influence the curriculum to be relevant, and again, having a consistent omni-channel voice, to borrow from the retail sector, to deliver learning in the way that I learn, in the way that I want to consume it, whether that be auditory, visual, and that requires, to your point, a skill or a developmental path for the university to understand, you know, there's a difference between, I'd be really interested in your perspective on this. Some say that being catapulted into this virtual learning mode has really butchered all of the pedagogy around learning, meaning that we were trying to make the case for storytelling versus PowerPoints. We were trying to make the case of meeting learners where they are, and virtual was front and center as an option. Now this crisis kind of rush to remote replication of everything we were doing with four walls has also led to disappointment. So it seems like there's a difference between this abrupt doing whatever I was doing only through a machine versus an instructional design that has built-in facilitated experiential learning, read, watch, practice, and that we every 3 minutes have something engaging or a poll. Do you see this current experience as setting the transformative agenda backwards, forwards? What say you?
No, so I disagree that is setting us backwards. I think it goes back to what I said before about the role of the educator, you know, and I don't blame the educator for not feeling prepared, right? A well-prepared, a fully equipped educator should know how to transition into an online space. So one of the things that I had to do, and I think we talked about this earlier, is human knowledge. Like sometimes you have to go and solicit all of those information and do the job of looking for those information. And one of the things I said was like, I know that I'm very effective in the classroom. I haven't taught online in years. Like I think the first course I taught at NYU was online, and that was 6 years ago, almost 7 years now. And so what needs to happen is that, you know, educators have to be agile. They have to definitely take the time to do some professional development. And what I found is that when you are looking for knowledge, you will find it. It's a key to a door. It would unlock the door of the unknown. And what I had to do was, how do I transform my own experience in the classroom online? And so I would say, I would give you guys some examples. Some of the things I would do, especially in the beginning when we finally made that transition, I wanted to know the state of mind of my students. So I did a poll question. I said, how do you feel today? And then I feel great, I feel somewhat great, and I'm not sure. And so I started with the folks that had, 20% of my class the first week on virtual said they weren't sure. And so the question was, why are you not sure about how you feel? And then I kind of poked at the people who felt great. And I said, what are your secret regimen that you can share with us about what is making you feel better? The long tail of it is that even now, I'm the type of instructor that would write on the board. I love the traditional way, kind of blended with the experiential. And now I pull up Google Docs, real time, give all of my students access. And so I'm typing up, and it depends on I'm a fast typer, so I could really keep up with what I'm saying. And even if I cannot keep up, I just have to delay my description of what it is that I'm putting down. And it's made the experience seem very seamless because people don't think that is, they don't feel the difference. So that's why I said the biggest job is really on the educator to really transform the room, right, in the classroom so that your students don't feel like they are in a virtual space. When your students start to feel like they're in a virtual space, that means you're not doing what you ought to do. And it's not their fault. Like, I'm definitely not blaming any educator. All I'm saying is that this provides a challenge for us to rise to. Our students are rising to that challenge. We as educators must continue to rise and make sure that the experience seems unbothered, right? And that's my take on that.
Well, that's, wow, thank you. I want to invite the rest of the panel back to join us. We have had great questions coming in, some similar, and I'll just go through a couple of these. The first one is for Josh, and it reads, Josh, considering overnight cultural shifts, what is the potential to slip back after we return to on-site? How might we best maintain the positive cultural shifts that emerge?
Okay. Well, first of all, in terms of the actual virus itself, all of the research that I've been through on the virus basically says that the only way to get rid of it is to quarantine the people who have it. So, you know, this social distancing reduces the speed, but it doesn't make it go away. So what we have to come up with is policies for testing and identifying people who are sick at work and getting them to go home immediately, and then contact tracing who they've touched or talked to or been close to. Now, you know, there's going to be all sorts of debate about whether that's correct and for employers to do that and so forth. And, you know, maybe there'll be some laws passed. But I think companies are going to have to face up to that and probably take responsibility for it. In terms of the social issues, I think the world is sort of playing out. I mean, I don't really believe that the Republicans want to get the virus and the Democrats don't, although it sort of feels that way. I think most people don't want to get it. So I think there's essentially a new cultural, and all these models of culture that companies have been created, there's a new one just got inserted that says health and safety from the virus. Because people are going to go to work. There was an article in the New York Times about it this week. People are going to go to work nervous, or they're not going to do their jobs well, or they're going to threaten to sue their employer. And this is going to happen. It's just like safety. It's like if you work in an oil company, there's very strict rules on safety. Do you know at Exxon, you're not allowed to skip stairs in the stairways. If you skip a step, you have to go back and take the step. There are safety policies because they know that people will trip and they'll hurt themselves. I think we're going to have to go do some of that stuff in companies. And I think most workers are going to be happy if companies do that. That's my gut.
No, that's a great question, and thank you for that response. Anna, I have a question coming in for you. Someone was touched by your reference to inclusion and connection to business and opportunities for us to do things differently. Also, there was a question that recognizes that part of what companies and both universities rely on to encourage that is their relationship with small businesses, suppliers, nonprofit organizations who are extraordinarily hit at times like this. And so the question from someone is, for those purpose-driven organizations whose inclusion commitments extends beyond the talent pipeline, how can they be partnering in ways that make sure that they don't arrive on the other side of the pandemic without strategic partners, diverse vendors, and the like? Any thoughts on that?
It's an excellent question. I think, and Josh, I know you wrote about that, looking at the trust index, Edelman's trust index. There was very little trust in society in general, in companies, in the business, in government to begin with at the time of the pandemic. So the pandemic is the moment of truth when the companies can actually step up and show what they can do and raise the trust levels of their employees, which is very, very important for their own recovery. And the other thing that I think the pandemic made so clear is this kind of ecosystem mentality. We were talking about stakeholder capitalism before, and kind of wanted to see how it was playing out, about the importance of stakeholders, not the shareholders. And I think how the companies are going to decide on which side of it they're going to end up is going to be very telling. And number one is how they're treating their employees. You know, even those companies that have to let their employees go, how the separation process happens, what is the benefits policy that they're setting up, what are the executives being paid at the same time as the employees are being laid off. All of this is being highlighted right now. And obviously, being a corporate citizen, those companies, and a few examples like JetBlue flying PPE and flying most critical medical supplies for free, you know, stepping up, contributing. to the solution. So that is all going to be looked at it will make or break their brands going forward. Insurance companies returning the fees because the clients are not driving or the customers are not driving cars, etc. So how the companies, first of all, treat their employees, and then how they are contributing to, solving for this crisis we're in.
Thank you, Anna, and thank you to the entire panel for making our experiences and resources accessible. Convening is incredibly important now and staying connected. And so I want to thank all of you for supporting me, supporting the discipline, and thank all of you for coming. And yes, this will be available for distribution after. But at the end of the day, really stay true to your purpose, take care of yourselves, and stay focused. And if anything, remember that we all came in on different shifts and subways, people here in New York, but we're all in the same boat now. And so it really is an opportunity for us to reimagine and reconnect, stay healthy, and stay connected. Thank you, and good day, good night.